I want to welcome today Shamil Idress, who is the CEO for Search for Common Ground. And we're very lucky to be able to talk with Shamil at such a fraught and busy time. I'm sure you've got a lot of other things to do, but we really value learning about what you do at Search and a little bit about your background. I want to start in the way that we started all of the other Beyond Intractability interviews with practitioners and ask you to go back and talk about how you got into the field of peace building and what your career path looked like before you got to Search.
Yeah, Heidi, it's great to be with you. Thank you for this. I didn't have much of a career before getting into peace building. I got in at an early age. I grew up in some ways typical of immigrant parents. My father was born in Syria and my mother in Turkey. And when I was growing up here in the US, where I was born, I had, a lot of experiences growing up across cultural, national, religious, political dividing lines. Nothing dramatic, but, we would go to Turkey every summer for a couple of months and live with my mother's extended family, which was, pretty, poor in Düzce, Turkey, which was a couple hours away from Istanbul, all of whom lived sort of in one big compound. And then I was growing up in New Canaan, Connecticut, which is one of the wealthier parts of this country, the US. Wasn't particularly diverse racially, in particular, or, sort of politically. And then I went to college at Swarthmore College, which is a Quaker school, and got exposed to conflict resolution there. Got trained outside of my classes in mediation and dialogue facilitation. And I think it really appealed to my upbringing in a way, because growing up, when you crisscross a lot of different dividing lines growing up, I think or at least for me, I formed very close, deep relationships, loving relationships with people who sometimes had stereotypes about one another. It also made it very difficult for me to see all the good on one side, all the bad on the other. I tended to identify with different aspects, even in the same dispute, that people had across dividing lines. So Swarthmore really kind of got its hooks in me with its Quaker roots, and I loved it. And then, as I was looking for, summer jobs in 1993 as a junior in college, two things happened. One is the Oslo Peace Accords, were signed, and that was sort of such a big deal at that time. And having grown up with family background in the Middle East, it was particularly interesting to me. So my first sort of real foray into conflict resolution was trying to initiate a Muslim-Jewish dialogue group on campus around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I talked about this elsewhere publicly. It was pretty much a disaster on all fronts. I still remember to this day, the only thing that really sticks in my mind about that session was as people were leaving, I remember thinking that they all seemed angrier than they were when they came in. So it wasn't exactly a wonderful success, but it definitely whet my appetite for this kind of work. And then I was looking for an internship that very summer, and I found a 2-sentence description about this organization called Search for Common Ground that was applying what was new to me, this whole field of conflict resolution and peace building, and applying it to a part of the world, the Middle East, where my family background was from, and I was always sort of interested in. So I applied, for, at that time, an unpaid internship, got that in 1993. And really, that was how my career started. And I loved it. I spent that summer with the organization, which at that time was about 10 staff in one office in Washington. But all of the experiences there really kind of left me with the impression. I remember leaving that summer thinking, oh, this is not something you just do, when you're young and then you have to get a quote unquote real job. This is something you could actually, this is something you could actually make a living doing. And that was very exciting to me. So when I graduated college a year later, I came back to Search for Common Ground and applied this time for an entry level, paying job, and was fortunate to get that. And then as my career evolved, I stayed at Search for about 10 years, left for about 10 years, did other work all in the peace building sector, and then returned to Search a little over 7 years ago when the founder and president, as well as the executive vice president, were both stepping aside.
Okay. So what did you do in those interim 10 years?
When I left Search, after my first 10 years with the organization, I worked first with the World Economic Forum and setting up, I had gotten involved with the World Economic Forum from my position at Search. I was the chief operating officer, by the time I left in that first period. And I helped the World Economic Forum set up something that at the time they called the Council of 100 Leaders. It was pulling together corporate, political, religious, and NGO leaders, all concerned particularly with relations between sort of the West and Muslim majority countries around the world, right? This is sort of post 9/11, all that kind of stuff. And so I helped set up that program. I was on the steering committee for that group, and I set up a funding mechanism through which, organizations that were doing good work to improve those relations could get funding. I then was appointed by Kofi Annan, who was Secretary General at the time at the UN, as deputy director of something called the UN Alliance of Civilizations. And that was an initiative started by the heads of state of Spain and Turkey, again, to try to improve, relations between kind of Western and Muslim majority countries and societies. So after the World Economic Forum, went to the UN, really enjoyed my time at the UN and saw peace building from a different perspective, more of a strictly political and diplomatic perspective. Frankly, I was so much more risk averse than what I was used to at Search for Common Ground, both at the World Economic Forum and at the UN. And in many ways, I think my experience at those places where there was a much more sort of elite level engagement on a more regular basis, but also much more risk aversion, gave me both an appreciation, and really convinced me the importance of what I might call a more kind of holistic, both kind of top down and bottom up approach to peace building. And so when I had one other step in my career before I came back to Search, I led an organization called Solia, which is a pioneer in using digital technologies to facilitate cross-cultural dialogue. Very similar mission again, but with a much more focused niche on how you use these interactive technologies, to build peace. So when I came back to Search, when the founder was getting ready to retire, I actually, brought Solia in some ways with me as a strategic partnership. So legally, it's sort of part of Search for Common Ground. So I returned to Search about, a little over 7 years ago now.
And is Solia now part of Search, or is it still operating independently, or isn't it operating anymore?
So it's legally it's part of Search, but for all intents. So there's in the nonprofit sector, there's something called a sole membership affiliation, which basically means, that I don't know how interesting this is to people, but it means that Solia is a membership organization, but only has one member, Search for Common Ground. What that means practically is that Search for Common Ground appoints and approves any additions to Solia's board. So theoretically, the Search for Common Ground board, could replace Solia's board. But in actuality, what it means is that Solia and Search enjoy a special strategic partnership. We cooperate and go after joint funding opportunities when it makes sense. But Solia maintains a separate, Wadehi Gokele is the brilliant CEO of Solia. They maintain the separate financial systems and programming. So it allows for a lot of flexibility. We can be separate entities when we need to be, but we can also be, joint, when it's helpful.
Okay, I was just interested because I was following Solia early on and really interested in the things that they were doing, and have to admit I've kind of lost track of where it's gone since then.
Yeah, they're great. They've been growing their programming, and they're doing both a lot of work between Muslim majority societies in the US and Western Europe, as well as increasingly offering online dialogue facilitation skill sets and training, both in the corporate sector and in the nonprofit sector. So they've been doing really wonderfully. I chair their board in all transparency, so that's yeah.
I realized as I asked you where you went after your first stint at Search, that before that I should have asked what you were doing at Search. You started at an entry-level position, ended up 10 years later as COO, I gather. That's quite a fast rise. How did you do that?
Well, two things about Search in those days. So, I came back to Search for Common Ground, and my first full-time position there was in 1994. And I was working on the same programming I had worked as an unpaid intern the previous summer, which was the Middle East program. And again, at that time, Search was established in 1982. And the focus of the organization from its founding was that 50% of the work would be domestic in the US and 50% would be international. And that was the case all the way up through that time that I interned in 1993 and then when I came back. But beginning in 1994 and 95, when Search started establishing offices overseas, we established programmatic offices in Burundi right after the Rwandan genocide and in Macedonia during the midst of the Balkans conflict. And then in 95, also established a European base in Brussels, which gave access to, funding from the EU and from some of the governments that are the primary supporters of peace building, the Scandinavian governments, the Dutch, et cetera, et cetera. And so once that happened in 94 and 95, Search's programming began growing significantly overseas. And the proportion of our work that was domestic here in the US really shrunk, relative to that international work. So when I came back to Search in 1994, it was just at the beginning of this growth spurt for the organization and this establishment of programming around the world. So I started working on the Middle East program in a support capacity, helping to do the logistics for the meetings and do all the organizing and invitations, et cetera. Ended up kind of moving up in my responsibilities in support of the Middle East program. I was very passionate about starting programming that might address the widening gap between Western and Muslim majority countries more broadly in the late 90s. The founder and president, John Marks, was very supportive of my efforts to do that. So I started a program for what we called at the time Islamic Western Trust and Cooperation. Did some support for our work between the United States and Iran, which is very related, to that broader field. And then an opportunity came up to lead Search's programs in Burundi in 1999. And at that time, the Burundi program was Search's largest program and was doing some really groundbreaking work. And I took that opportunity and really learned a tremendous amount. I was really privileged to work with colleagues in Burundi doing groundbreaking work. I mean, they were later recognized by who became Secretary of State Kerry for helping to prevent genocide in that country. And that was an extraordinary privilege. And it also connected a lot of the dots for me in terms of conflict dynamics that cut across. I'd spent so much of my time working on the Middle East and sort of Muslim-Western relations, for lack of a better term. And so the experience in Burundi was really formative for me in a lot of ways.
So tell me a little bit more about that. When you say groundbreaking work, I think of the media work and the soap operas that I know about that may have been later, I'm not sure. But what were they doing at the time that was so groundbreaking?
Actually, well, Heidi, you're exactly right. In many ways, like after the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, when I wasn't involved in this assessment, but when Search did an assessment in Burundi and came across some very dynamic and creative Burundians who said, the best thing that could be done here would be to use media, particularly radio, in just as powerful a way as it was used in neighboring Rwanda. In that case, Radio Milcolin infamously was really pivotal in organizing and mobilizing the genocide in that country, as you know. And the idea of this creative Burundian activist was you could do the same thing, but in reverse. But you would really need to have a multi-ethnic staffed media outlet, and that's never been done at that time. And so Studio Ijambo was really the first multi-ethnic staffed radio outlet in the Great Lakes region of Africa. And, the soap opera programming was one thing. There was a program, I will completely ruin the Kirundi version of the word, but in English was Our Neighbors Ourselves. It was a soap opera about, Hutu and Tutsi family living side by side and the daily issues that would come up between them, neighborly disputes and romances and all the stuff that happens. But always sort of integrated into it was deal with differences constructively and with respect, right? And so that was integrated into dramatic radio soap opera programming. But there was news programming. Some of the most groundbreaking work were, the teams there, the journalist teams, the Hutu Tutsi paired journalist teams who were really quite courageous and innovative. Where one journalist would go to one community, let's say there was a massacre somewhere, and one journalist could go and speak to the military and speak to the police and get one version of what had happened, and the other could go to the community itself. And oftentimes those journalists weren't welcomed or immediately trusted because of their own ethnic identity and background across those divides. But when they would work together, they could tell, a much more accurate story about what had happened by getting these different perspectives. And so even though throughout those years, they would get a lot of pressure and sometimes very high level pressure on them and even threats, we also had plenty of evidence that their programming, that programming that they were doing at Studio Jumbo was more listened to, including by people in the military and government, as well as farmers and the community, than anything else for those reasons. And so it was news programming, it was soap opera programming, it was call-in shows, it was comedy programs, it was music, it was all kinds of programming that Studio Jumbo, was really the base for. And that really became a model then for something that teams in Liberia and Sierra Leone pioneered with what was called Talking Drum Studio. Talking Drum Studios now exist and are totally locally run entities now that Search spun off over these last few years in both Liberia and Sierra Leone, and played really pivotal roles in those countries. We used radio in Democratic Republic of Congo and Central African Republic and all over Sub-Saharan Africa. So, but Studio Jumbo is really the first place where that radio programming was pioneered by those very courageous Burundian journalists and producers. And since then, we've developed a range of television programming. Much of it was pioneered in the Balkans with Sesame Workshop, and then we expanded that to reality TV, and now we're doing more and more.
Are you there? You cut out a little bit.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm still here.
Oh, okay, good. The sentence ended abruptly, and I wasn't sure where we were. So it's my understanding that the reason that you did radio in Burundi is that was the main outlet for people to get information, that they didn't have television much and they didn't get newspapers. Is that correct?
Yes. I mean, we try to use media everywhere that we work, and whichever media will have the furthest reach. But our experience and perspective is that media tends to go broad, but not very deep. So while we try to use media everywhere that we work, we don't just do media anywhere. I mean, everywhere that we work, we try to complement that media programming with direct community outreach, fostering cooperation between divided communities, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, in that case, radio is by far the best medium if you want to reach the most people. In other cases, it's increasingly digital. In some cases, it's television. Yeah.
Okay. We'll get back to that in a little bit, but let me finish up your personal history. You went to Burundi, stayed there for how long?
Just a couple of years before I was offered this. That the organization was growing at that time, and so the chief operating officer position that I took up after I left Burundi hadn't existed until then. So that was the first time that Search sort of created that position. And John Marks, the founder of the organization, and Susan Collin Marks, the executive vice president, John established the organization and Susan largely built it. That's kind of how I put it, because, John established Search in 1982. I can share, if you're interested, the founding story of the organization and why he established it. Search was really the outgrowth of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, the U.S. war in Vietnam. John was a foreign service officer, an American foreign service officer, and he quit the foreign service in protest to the war. And then he joined the staff of the senator, the Republican senator, Senator Case, I think it was, who wrote the legislation that cut the funding to the war, which is ultimately what ended the American involvement in Vietnam. And then John went on to a career as an investigative journalist, and he wrote two quite acclaimed, the one best-selling expose of the CIA, which got him in a lot of hot water, with the U.S. government. So he wasn't exactly a cult figure, but he was becoming a known figure in the kind of anti-war, anti-government movements of the 60s and 70s. And in the late 70s, he had what he still describes to this day as a life-changing epiphany that really on two fronts. One was that, as he still puts it, that he realized his whole life was oriented around adversarial advocacy, always in a very negative space. And as he puts it, sort of everything was about tearing down the old system, which he was beginning to realize was not the same thing as building the new system, right? And the second realization that was associated with that was that, as black and white as these issues were to him from the outside, when he engaged with them and met people across some of these dividing lines that he was so active along, that he sometimes had to acknowledge that some of those people who disagreed with him actually were people of principle, who he actually came to respect. And that made it harder to put things in such clear, black and white terms. And so he, in 1982, very explicitly, left behind him that career of adversarial advocacy as an approach. He wanted to establish a place that, rather than, choose one side and go to war with the other side, literally or figuratively, would actually, bring sides together. But his whole idea was that the whole notion here was not to bring sides together for some kind of, watered down lowest common denominator compromises, but rather with the right kind of trust building and relationship building, you might be able to generate highest common denominator solutions that nobody would have thought possible if they just stayed in their separate camps, battling it out with one another. So that was sort of the core idea when John established Search in 1982. And again, at that time, his focus was that half of that work should be done in the US, where the dividing lines coming out of the Vietnam era and Watergate were so profound, as well as internationally, with an initial focus on US-Soviet relations. The Cold War was still raging in 1982. And that's what the organization did for those first, 13 or so years. He met Susan in the early 90s, who was a South African activist, peace activist. And Susan and John, in many ways were very complementary to one another in terms of they were very aligned in terms of their vision and ethics and how they had committed their lives. But they also had very different, strengths. And so when Susan joined the organization then after they got married in the early to mid 90s, 93 or 94, the organization really started expanding, largely with Susan's leadership and establishing these offices around the world and this kind of thing and grew from there. So when I joined in 1993 and then came back after graduating college a year later in 1994, that was really at the moment where the organization just started growing, in that first sort of spurt of growth. So when I was in Burundi in 99 and 2000, by then the organization had grown, I don't remember now, I think it was about 350 staff, and there might have been offices in maybe 8 countries or so at that point, which was a lot more than when I joined, it was 10 staff and 1 office in DC. They not only wanted to establish this chief operating officer position, but they also wanted to oversee programming because they were quite interested in moving themselves, Susan and John, to Jerusalem to take a direct hand in our Middle East programming. And so that's what I did, in the early 2000s, from 2000 to 2004.
So why then did you leave?
A couple of reasons. I mean, one is, first I got married. And my wife had sort of, in the years that we were dating before we got married, and then after we got married, she had largely followed me. My career had picked up, and I was, moving around a lot. And she had come to visit me in Burundi when I lived there, and she landed a tenure track position at New York University, and we lived a whole year of our marriage, our first year of marriage, kind of going back and forth between New York and DC, which was not ideal. And so it was really my opportunity to support her, and I could stay engaged in this field, which I still really loved. And I ended up, at the World Economic Forum initially for a year, and then I got this appointment to work at the UN for Kofi Annan, which was really an extraordinary opportunity for me as well. So I always kept, tied to Search and always was interested in Search. And as I shared with you, I think honestly that experience at the World Economic Forum and at the UN. Those experiences underscored for me the value of highly adaptive, flexible, and risk-taking approaches to peace building, which is not, there are other strengths and benefits, I think, of both the World Economic Forum, which has as its primary base the corporate sector, and the United Nations, which of course is the primary global multilateral organization in the world. So there's strengths in terms of the peace building practice in each of these places, but I came to appreciate all the more the sort of adaptability, locally rooted nature, and risk-taking appetite of an organization like Search that could nevertheless still engage with and support high-level processes, but also drive and support, community-led peace building.
Makes sense. So then you came back when?
So I came back to Search in 2014.
Okay.
2014, yeah. in the August or September of 2014.
Okay, and then you were CEO.
Yeah, so I succeeded both John and Susan in that role as CEO and president. And by that time, the organization had grown significantly. I don't think staffing was maybe 700 people or so. I think it might have been, or maybe six. It was 650 or so people at that time. The organization was in, I think it was 28 countries or so, or maybe even more. And the budget had grown. It was about a $40 million a year, organization at that time. So it had grown a lot, but it still maintained this commitment to locally led, creative, risk-taking, both top-down, bottom-up peace-building processes. And so I loved it. So I came back to the organization, at that time. So it was about 7.5 years ago now.
And how big is Search now?
We employ just over 1,000 people. We have offices in 30 countries. And our annual budget, I think our budget last year was about 65 million.
Wow, okay. Well, one of the things that struck me as you told this story is that I could see the need, and I don't know whether you agree with me on this, but I see the need of Search coming full circle, because you said early on it had 50% of its work in the United States, and I don't know whether you'd want to have 50% of your work in the United States now, probably not, but a lot of folks in the peace building field are coming around to the notion that, we really need it here too. And suddenly we discovered that the Cold War isn't over anymore.
Yeah.
So gee whiz, it seems like there's opportunity and need to go back to the roots and start working in those areas again. Or is there any talk about doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. More than talk. We launched by far our most ambitious domestic program ever in our history last year, Common Ground USA. We recruited an excellent leader, Neelan Parker, out of the Bridging Divides Initiative at Princeton. She had previously served as the acting director of the Office of Transition Initiatives at USAID. So she's had experience with both supporting international peace building and conflict transformation, as well as domestically looking at these dividing lines. So Neelan is leading a small foundational team that we're growing called Common Ground USA. So we're, I had always wanted us to be more active here in the US. And to be honest with you, in 2017, we took a stab at it. We tried this, wrote proposals and kind of approached different foundations and just could not get the traction that we wanted to. I remember citing plummeting levels of trust between communities in the US, both kind of horizontal trust as their intercommunal trust across racial and especially political lines, as well as plummeting levels of trust for almost pretty much every institution, certainly government, but media, even some of those institutions that had previously been, immune from those trust plummets, the military, religion, et cetera, like plummeting levels of trust across the board. And we were saying, look, we've seen this before. We know where this leads. And we just couldn't generate the support that we had hoped at that time.
Wow.
After January 6th of last year, I don't want to say we just dusted off the proposals from 2017, but kind of. And we were this time able to get, more support, combination of private sector, like foundation funding, as well as government funding, diversity, a politically diverse funding base, which is important to us given the political divides in this country. And so that programming is growing. In terms of your other point, I think we've been saying, Heidi, for years that we really feel like the whole system that was set up after World War II to prevent violent conflict and foster international cooperation, that system, represented first and foremost by the UN, but other multilateral institutions like the EU and the African Union and the Arab League, et cetera, But that system was clearly, we weren't geniuses in this, everyone was saying this, that system was clearly faltering, if not collapsing. And, we were seeing for years, really with the turn of the century, you could even maybe say with the beginning, maybe before then, with the Rwandan genocide in 1994, but you could see that system was struggling with one kind of conflict that was proliferating, and that whole system was not set up to deal with. And that was weak governments and, civil wars and conflicts within societies, within countries. that system that was set up on the principle of national sovereignty, where, you and I, if we're recognized nation states, we get a seat at the table, and we agree to one principle, which is I'm not going to invade your borders, you're not going to invade mine, and on that basis, we'll try to work everything else out, right? And that system that was set up in that way was really struggling to deal with, well, what if Heidi starts turning on her own people, as happened in Rwanda? Or what if you have, non-state actors, whether it's ISIS, ideological, religious kind of a driver, or the Sinaloa cartel, drug cartels and criminal gangs that move well beyond urban phenomenon that are now national, regional, global networks, or racist hate groups, some of these groups that have inspired attacks from Christchurch, New Zealand to El Paso, Texas. Like that whole system that was set up after World War II just really could not deal either with the collapsing states on the one hand, or with these non-state actors that increasingly were every bit as destabilizing as state militaries. Because the Sinaloa cartel doesn't have a seat at the UN, the ISIS doesn't have a seat, they don't play by those rules. So we were seeing that for years, and a lot of people were saying, look, we're seeing a 25-year high in levels of violent conflict, largely because of this kind of conflict that state-to-state diplomacy system just cannot deal with. Governments move too slowly, they're not adept at dealing with that kind of conflict, and that kind of conflict does not respect national borders to begin with. It either happens within nations or in very networked horizontal ways. Now we're seeing even the very kind of conflict that whole system was set up to prevent, which, in many ways it was quite successful at preventing, with all the inconsistencies and the challenges of that system, which I don't want to gloss over. An interstate war on the European continent that threatens to engulf many, many countries well beyond Europe. That was the very kind of conflict that the multilateral system was set up to deal with, and did largely prevent until now, for the most part. And so now we're seeing both of those kinds of conflict proliferating, and the system's really struggling to deal with them. So, on your second point, your first point was about U.S. work. Your second point was about this. I think that, the best case scenario, I think of what we can see here is that in previous points in history where you've had some kind of world order that kind of maintained relative stability for decades, like where you've seen those systems collapse and a new system come about, it's tended to come through the crucible of really cataclysmic violence. After the Council of Europe or the Treaty of Versailles or whatever and the last time this happened was World War I and World War II. And so in many ways, what I feel like we're seeing now is that old system that's been teetering for a couple decades now, at least, may be collapsing. And the hope is, well, could we accelerate the emergence of a new or revitalized or evolved form, of world order, without having to pass through as cataclysmic violence, which we're already starting to see in Ukraine and could spread well beyond that. And it's terrifying, and it's devastating in terms of human life. To put it mildly, I think you're really right that the best case scenario is that this focuses the mind sufficiently of political leaders around the world as well as activists to really accelerate the emergence of a better system for preventing violent conflict and fostering cooperation, because the old system is collapsing.
Do you see any proposals or do you personally have any ideas of what such a better system might look like?
I mean, you could look at the whole UN reform agenda and see plenty of proposals. You can see plenty of things that point out the failings and the fault lines within that system. The problem of having permanent members of the UN Security Council that basically reflect who won World War II and that don't have any representation from the entire continents of Africa and South America, some of the largest population centers in the whole world. The fact that system is so reliant on state-to-state diplomacy, whereas non-state actors are increasingly influential. So are there ways to evolve that system so it can better integrate and connect with and foster cooperation from the private sector, both nonprofit, civil society type activism, as well as the corporate sector? The woefully underrepresented nature, not just in terms of states, but in terms of gender, how many, that we've got to move beyond a system where it's mainly older, largely white, but older men cutting deals behind closed doors, and you have to have much greater representation from women in decision-making roles, as well as much greater representation and integration of youth voices. All of these things there's a litany of these things that have come out again and again that people can point to, and they're really all of which are relevant. And I'm not, I don't pretend to be smart enough to know what that next system will look like, but to be more effective than the current system, it seems to me that all of those things that I just identified have to be integrated somehow or another in what comes next. I think the other thing that's going to be hard we have to recognize, I think, that if the system is viewed by major powers like China and Russia, not the least of which two major nuclear powers, Russia is not nearly the economic force that China or the US or even Germany or many others are, but it's a nuclear power. It's the biggest nuclear power in the world. If major powers experience and genuinely view that international system as fundamentally antithetical to their interests, it is not going to be effective. So what do you do about that? Do you try to foster a renewed political commitment from all countries, including all the nuclear powers, to a system that they really do feel like is in their shared and mutual interest? And does that mean, you're much more cognizant of not, letting that system be utilized to erode the influence and the power of those countries, or to, now in the midst of the Ukraine war, it's hard to give voice to this because the first and foremost preoccupation now of all of us has to be to end the slaughter of what's going on there. And coming out of that, we have to have some sort of new, if it's not a new security architecture, then it's a new politics within the existing security architecture that hopefully Russia, China are as committed to as Western Europe and the US, and not to mention greater representation from other regions of the world. And figuring that out is not as simple. I think we have learned some things. If you look at even, it was interesting, if you looked at, we at Search have developed this global impact framework. We looked at the different frameworks for how you measure peacebuilding progress and impact. And, one of the things that's, I think, holding our field back is that there is really no alignment on how you gauge success and how you measure that success. And so we looked at different frameworks that came out of the UN system, the SCORE methodology out of UNDP. We looked at the ones that's used by the Institute of Economics and Peace, their 8-factor positive peace index. We looked at sort of the different indices and different frameworks that are used to measure progress in peace building and sustainable peace, and then worked with the local communities and stakeholders in the countries where we operate around the world to translate that into a framework that we could utilize to design programming, so that there would be a framework that would really, because right now, if I look at the Institute of Economics and Peace's Global Peace Index, for instance, I love the fact that it's gotten this issue on the global agenda. I like that The Economist reports on it. It starts a debate. People say, oh, gee, the US fell 8 points and Vietnam went up 7 points. What does that mean? I love all of that. I think that's really important, and that's great. It's not granular enough to be relevant to a peacebuilding implementing organization like ours. And yet some of the tools that organizations like ours have been using are way too granular for policymakers to understand or to apply when they're making policy, or funders, and so you need a framework. I think we really need a framework that is locally grounded and rooted enough to inform programming in different neighborhoods, but ideally generalizable enough across conflicts so that it can inform policy decisions about peace and conflict. So anyway, that's a long-winded way of sort of going about saying, so we developed this global impact framework that really tracks 5 themes. Intercommunal trust, or social cohesion, it's sometimes called. Institutional legitimacy, or vertical cohesion, it's sometimes called. Do people have any faith or belief in the systems that govern and serve them? Levels of physical violence, the third. Agency. the sense that people, it's a very subjective measure of, do people think that what they do makes any difference whatsoever to their futures, that they can do anything to improve their children's lives or their community's well-being, et cetera. And fifth, resourcing. Our resources, or our national budgets and other things going towards more securitized approaches, or are they going towards collaborative, non-violent problem-solving approaches in social wealth, the welfare of societies? So those are 5 sort of themes. And then for each of those themes, wherever we're working, we engage with a diversity of local stakeholders, community members, government, and others, to define, well, in this context, what would that indicator, what would an indicator of success there be like? So I remember in Myanmar at one point, it was, are people building with cinder blocks rather than mud? Because if they're building with cinder blocks, that's an indicator that they feel secure about the future, that they can stay, obviously that's not the same measure that you would have in Tarrant County, Texas, where we're working, for instance, but you'd have other measures there. And so this global impact framework, the reason I'm going into all of that is when we think about what's the next system, what are the systems that deliver, more sustainable peace and that prevent violent conflict? To me, it would be systems that advance those 5 indicators, which are not always what people would expect. So for instance, there's a lot of push around democracy and democratization. I think we've seen really clearly that there can be illiberal democracies and democracies that don't deliver on those 5 fronts, and there can be more autocratic systems that actually do. I mean, if you look at the Lancet, the Lancet of all places, right? So the Lancet just published a major study of more than, I think they did like over 150 countries, trying to assess what the factors were that explained a more effective COVID response. And in the study that they reported, one of the reasons I picked this out is I sent this around to our leadership team because it reflected exactly what our institutional learning team has baked into this global impact framework. And what they said, interestingly, if you look at the Lancet report, the Washington Post picked out, this was widely reported, but the Lancet was the one that published the full study. But it basically said that a lot of the things that researchers expected would correlate to an effective COVID response, wealth of the country, democratic systems, maybe democratic systems would be more effective than autocratic systems, or that these things were actually not relevant in terms of correlation. That the 2 most important factors when they looked across countries that had a more effective COVID response were 2 indicators of trust. One was interpersonal trust, and the other was institutional trust. And those things you would think, people will oftentimes think, oh, well, democratic systems deliver that more. Democratic systems deliver institutional legitimacy because you voted for those people, or democratic institutions would deliver a sense of agency, but actually no. And so the reason I'm going into all of that is I think that we've grabbed onto certain proxies of what we think are progress. And this is not a screed against democratic systems, but it's more that when we look at impact at Search, we look less at some of the trappings or the proxies that are sometimes assumed to deliver greater, healthy, sustainable, and just societies, and look more at these indicators of trust, horizontal trust, vertical trust, levels of physical violence, sense of agency, and resourcing. And those are the things that when we look at whatever system will come next, Heidi, my hope is it would be a system that maximizes for those deliverables, and recognizes that those can come in different ways for different cultures. And this is part of why I think when the UN system was established, the term that was highlighted was self-determination. It wasn't necessarily democracy, it was self-determination. So anyway, I'm going deep on the democracy point just because it's one of many areas where you sort of hear this notion of that the international system should be democracy promoting. And I'm not against democratic, development. I think it's wonderful. But I think if you're looking at peace and conflict, you need to actually look at some of these other factors and not so much on the structure.
Makes sense. So I'm listening to you and thinking about a question and an exercise I give to my students. I teach a class in reconciliation, and I assert that in order to work towards reconciliation, you have to have some notion about what that is. So we do a visioning exercise, sort of like what you just did, of saying what sort of society would we want to see if we got to where we wanted to be. And then the next question is, okay, how do we get there from where we are? So it strikes me that I agree with what you said, that in many dimensions and most places, we're very far from reaching what I would consider to be a good level of trust, a good level of lack of violence, a good level of sense of efficacy. You had a different word for it, agency. How do we get from, and I'm asking this both locally and globally. We've got the UN, we've got the state system that everybody realizes is outmoded, but how do we move beyond it without cataclysmic violence? Or are we doomed to that?
This literally keeps me up at night, and I'm with you. I think that is the question. Because we do not have a great track record. You know, this whole phrase of sometimes you need a breakdown to have a breakthrough. Well, that's all great if a breakdown is a minor little blip, but when a breakdown is millions of lives destroyed and tens or hundreds of thousands of people killed, we can't abide by that, and we can't. So we can't be sanguine about that. And so I think we are seeing indicators that are hopeful. We're seeing we have never seen, I think, a truly global peace movement. We've seen peace movements in reaction to wars and an effort to prevent wars. But our team in Sierra Leone did something really extraordinary. They were featured. They were featured in the BBC and elsewhere for this. In the lead up to the elections there, I'm going to get the dates wrong. It was like 5 years ago now. It was some time ago. They became sort of the backbone organizing body for the largest collection of civil society organizations in the history of Sierra Leone, hundreds of organizations across all the different ethnic and regional divides in the country. This was in the lead up to the elections where people were nervous about what happened around the elections. And they developed something called a Citizens Manifesto, where they basically said to each of the political parties and the leaders who are running for office that you each have your political platforms and you're selling us on them, you're trying to get our votes. Well, we, the people, have a Citizens Manifesto, and it basically says no matter which of you wins, I think there were 7 demands. There are 7 things that we all agree you need to do, and they went to transparency in the finances. They went to representation in the cabinet, women's representation. They went to a number of factors. I don't want to get the details because I get them wrong. But it was, and they went to each of the leading candidates, said, we want you to sign this. If you have any interest in getting our vote, you need to sign this. And it was a flipping of the script of really mobilizing collective opinion to set some standards for things that are, you can have differences on a lot of things, but here are non-negotiables, for us. It's a very democratic approach. And I think that globally, we do have the seeds and the ingredients of that kind of a powerful, we have the largest youth cohort in history. Young people are inheriting really a hellacious situation between climate and the security challenges that we're facing, our inability to prevent and stop the spread of pandemics, So in the anger that we are sensing and the fear and desperation that we're sensing from young people, there are the seeds of that kind of a truly powerful movement that I think gives me some hope. And on the other end of the scale, the political leadership that you see, I hope to God that if the previous wars didn't do it, that this current war in Ukraine might spark sufficient political will to go back to the drawing table and refashion, if not restructure, then at least evolve the politics of how the multilateral system right now is being managed. You asked me if I see it on that front. I have to be honest with you, I'm less hopeful, mainly because all of these issues that are playing out to the international level, multilateral institutions are always as strong or as weak as what's going on at the national level of their members. And all of these issues that are playing out at the multilateral level are playing out at the state level within individual member states. The level of trust, the disillusionment with governments, the disillusionment with democratic systems, even that you're seeing from populations, and that keeps leaders very short term. They're constantly, it's like they're surfing a hurricane, and it's very difficult for them to look beyond to, okay, how do we step back, and that's sadly why I think sometimes those cataclysmic periods of violence end up being the trigger for really taking that step back and refashioning. But I do think I'm hopeful that there's more a sense of interdependence now. Each era that this happens, there's a greater sense that the win-lose framework is, at the end of the day, pretty lose-lose. And I think you're starting to see more of that. I think China's in a very difficult position now vis-a-vis Ukraine. And I think they're without getting into the politics of Ukraine right now, I guess I would just say that my biggest hope comes from the combination of an unprecedented youth movement that we have the seeds of and the communication tools to see emerge now that we've never truly seen globally, and some hope that at the level of political leadership, this will be enough of a wake-up call, hopefully without this turning into an even broader war, or one that involves nuclear, weapons, to really kind of reset the multilateral framework and how it's operating. But I agree with you. I think you raised precisely the question, and I don't know. I'm very worried. I think we all are.
Yeah. When we were scheduled to talk a couple of weeks ago, you said that you weren't able to because you were engaging on Ukraine, and that was right when the war started. And I'm wondering what role Search, if any, is playing to try to influence what's going on diplomatically, or does the peace building field really on the sidelines and have no influence on this whatsoever?
Well, for the field as a whole, I don't know. I'm aware of some international negotiators who have made efforts. I don't know that any of them are having any influence. I don't think we have had any particular influence, or I think it's frankly unlikely on this immediate crisis. There are two things that we have been doing because we played a very kind of facilitative and kind of integrative role in the youth peace building space. We're very involved in the development of the UN Security Council Resolution 2250 on youth peace and security, and then translating that into frameworks and funding and other kinds of support for youth peace building. We have been almost sort of by default and working with a few other organizations to facilitate regular consultations online between on-the-ground youth activists in Ukraine, and increasingly Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus, and we will continue to support those dialogues and that sort of solidarity formation. So those happen regularly. At the political level, or at more of the, we do have we have a lot of history with Russia as an organization. We were, as I mentioned to you, we were started on U.S.-Soviet relations, and so at that time, I think the first meetings that Search for Common Ground ever organized in 1982 were between former CIA and KGB officials meeting for the first time in an effort to prevent nuclear war, basically. And some of those relationships still exist. Some of those people have aged out, but we also maintained and reinvigorated some of those networks around a Track 2 process for Syria between Russian and American and other policymakers. And so we are planning this month to engage again and reinvigorate that network of senior Russian policy advisors. Between us, my sense is that what we are really looking to, if we could have any influence on the current war, we would love to. But I think our focus is a little bit further down the horizon on what would be the arrangements, or the pathway to an arrangement that could enable us to come out of this war less likely to go to World War III, rather than
Yeah.
more likely, and so those are more the conversations that we're seeking to open up and facilitate and cooperate with others who are working in that space. Yeah.
A phrase that we've been using, and I've seen a lot of other people using it in the print, is that we need an off-ramp. Putin needs an off-ramp. There just isn't any clear way for him to get out of this system that I acknowledge he largely created, but okay, fine. That's water under the bridge now. There has to be some way to allow him to save face and step off without starting global nuclear war. And it strikes me that an organization like Search, particularly with your ties to both US and Russian leaders, might be able to play a role in coming up with a rough framework of an off-ramp. Does that seem remotely feasible?
I would love if that were true. The William Ury, the international negotiator and mediation supporter, and talks about kind of envisioning the victory speeches that every key leader would be making, and working back from those victory speeches, not unlike the visioning exercise you talked about doing with your students. So what's the victory speech or put another way, the face-saving off-ramp that would enable Putin, Zelensky, the Europeans, the Americans, all the major stakeholders here to give that speech and enable an end to the violence. I think the obviously the fear that a lot of people have is that absent that, what we might see is just a real devastation and leveling of cities, so yeah, I would like to see that kind of an off-ramp, clarified and made, and could the Chinese be a key player in offering that off-ramp to Putin, or anyway, they're different parties that might be able to do that. I think what's one of the things that's difficult is that I don't in any way, I understand and it's very understandable why we've seen Germany's defense budget double overnight, and Finland talk about joining NATO, and Japan overturn decades of post-World War II defense policy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Sweden arming resistance, and yet in the bigger picture, I find it difficult to rejoice over these things. Where basically it's not the direction the world needs to move in, but it's very understandable given what's happening right now, why these things are happening. If they can hasten the end of this bloody war and open up a pathway to a better system that will prevent this kind of thing from happening again, then great. But yeah, I think absent some sort of a face-saving off-ramp, and people kind of fantasize about Putin being gone, but the indicators are that the very small circle of some people say fewer than 5 people who are most influential on him are not necessarily. He's been describing, it was Julia Ioffe, who's an expert on Russia. Misquote her, I think it was she who said that he's the moderating force in that group. It's not as if you can imagine worse, and that's always the case with violent conflict, where you say this is horrible, and unfortunately, it can pretty much always get worse. And so, I don't want to claim that Search can have that influence. I wish we could. And as we engage with people, if there's any opening to have any positive influence, we would grab it. In the meantime, I know others are trying to do the same.
Let's redirect now to the United States, where I think you might indeed have more effect. Tell me more about the US program.
There are really 2 legs to it. One is around resilience and preventing violence, political violence in particular. And the other is the longer term but critical element of building a more inclusive and just society, right? And so on the resilience front, there are, as we've seen in other settings, you know, in hyperpolarized societies, you could have an act of political violence, right? And it might bring a country together, it might bring a community together. Something terrible could happen, and it would unite. In hyperpolarized contexts, and we haven't seen really since the 60s, we haven't seen, fortunately, political assassinations. And it's been more than 10 years since we had something the scale of the Oklahoma City bombing. There's been plots foiled and this kind of thing. But our perspective is that's precisely the kind of political violence that we are on a pathway towards, given how armed the country is and how divided it is, and the degree to which we're living, it seems, in different worlds of reality, depending on what media we follow. So the first focus is, how do you prevent political violence? And if it were to happen, how do you keep it from, spinning out of control? And so, a lot of our efforts on that front are focused on the predictable markers of elections. Those are moments always of heightened division, understandably. And so working with a network of other organizations to try to forge agreements and run scenarios and prepare different people who could be influential across the political aisle to either prevent political violence around elections and or to mobilize very quickly should something happen, so that the narrative vacuum that opens up when something like that happens is not filled by further, divides. And you can see, even with the January 6th events in this country, that those events did not exactly bring the country back together again, just accelerated and exacerbated the divisions. And that's what happens in hyperpolarized societies when you have political violence. The other side of the equation is building more inclusive country and societies. And that's where a lot of the work on fostering and facilitating dialogue across dividing lines, strengthening the role of youth activists to apply more of what we would call a common ground approach, non-adversarial, but quite effective activism across political, racial, and other dividing lines, and really trying to strengthen the hand of those who are driving change across dividing lines that serve all. And so, right now we have three major areas of programming that fit roughly into those two categories of work. But Neelan, who we recruited just, like 4 months ago now, is adapting that strategy and building out, more programming. And we're very excited, for where that's headed. We've formed partnerships with different local organizations and national networks. There's a lot of activity going on in this country, largely spurred after January 6th. But there's obviously a lot of experience and activism related to racial injustice and more inclusive societies that predates January 6th. And so we're doing our best to really make sure we understand and collaborate with, rather than in any way duplicate or crowd out any of those efforts. And so that's what we're doing. And people can see Common Ground USA on our website and see some of the examples of what we're doing, but that'll be evolving a lot and growing. I anticipate a fair amount over the coming 1 to 2 years.
One of the things that I've seen with some of the folks who are doing this that worries me is that they're so focused on recruiting voices from low power communities that they are perceived by the Republican, I'm making a broad generalization here, but the Republican Christian right as just working to empower the enemy against them, and they're not going to be effective, as I see it, in actually bridging the divide between Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and liberals. How do we do both things at once? Build trust with the current white power base so that they don't arm up against things that we're doing, but at the same time become more inclusive?
I mean, it's interesting. I think it's as you've just sort of indicated, perception is in many ways, it's not that reality isn't important, especially in this era of alternative facts and even the most basic things being contested. Facts are important. But in terms of what drives behavior, perception is everything. And so if people perceive a peace building effort as really a Trojan horse for the victory of one side against the other, and for the most part in this space, what we see is a perception that a lot of what is presented as peace building in nature is in fact advancing a liberal political agenda, then we're going to fail to actually unite the country and move it forward on a lot of those issues of racial and other kinds of injustice in this country. So I think to answer your question, my perspective is that you have to engage the diversity of constituencies in the agenda setting and in the issue framing to begin with. You can't frame the issues in the ways that you see them and then try to recruit a diversity of people to that issue. It just doesn't, it fails everywhere, always. So in the work that we initiated piloting in Tarrant County, Texas, we've been working with the Baptist Association of Tarrant County, which is a primary partner, and a diversity of, you mentioned the Christian right, evangelical Christian leaders who are concerned about the divisions in the church, the politicization of the church, and the degree to which conspiracy theories and other things are pulling the church apart. And we've been working with them first and foremost to do listening tours in the community. First, we really do hear how people themselves see these issues across racial, political, and other dividing lines, and then to frame the issues accordingly. So the word extremism might not end up at all in the framing that people of what will bring people to the table. And I think this is, in some ways, anathema to people who say, no, look, you have to name things and you have to, it is somehow unprincipled to not name a spade or say that injustice is here. But our experience in divided societies everywhere in the world, not just in the U.S., is that people come to the same issues from very different perspectives. And the really powerful work that truly transforms conflict begins by setting that agenda collaboratively with people who have constituency. And people who have constituency might not be people who you like or whose views you agree with. They could be people whose views make your blood boil. And we will be critiqued, and we have been at Search and other peacebuilding organizations that take this kind of approach will be critiqued for talking to anyone. But our main criteria for who we will engage are who has constituency. And oftentimes that is underrepresented communities, as you were just alluding to, who have constituency, but sometimes not power. And sometimes those are people who have constituency and over-exaggerated elements of the levers of power that they control, right? And so, in listening to communities and what is, I think one of my concerns with what's happening right now is I think too much faith is being put in dialogue for dialogue's sake. In really divided societies, I think dialogue is absolutely necessary, but usually totally insufficient. And in fact, if you put too much faith in dialogue, over time, people get very burnt out and cynical about it. In the same way that people across Israel and Palestine, that peace process is sort of a dirty term there. When you put too much faith in processes that don't deliver on the very core drivers of conflict that are destroying lives, over time, those processes lose any legitimacy or any support. And so we are, we're not against dialogue. It's great to see all this effort to foster interracial dialogue, red-blue, political, bipartisan political dialogue. But in our experience, you have to translate dialogue into cooperative action. And the way you translate dialogue into cooperative action is listening for those areas of common ground, wherever they might be, from those who have constituency. And in very divided society, sometimes that area of common ground is really small and seemingly silly. The number of soccer tournaments we've organized between police and youth in different countries, because that's the one thing that would get them together when they've been clashing, in the streets, whether in Nepal or Congo or whatever. I can't tell you how many times, but those are used as an opening of a relationship that then enables further areas of common ground to be identified and mobilized collaboratively around. And so I think we have to have at Search, we have a sort of three-step process: humanize, mobilize, systematize, right? And it starts at that very human level where you're really listening to people across these dividing lines, not inviting them to an agenda that you framed, but listening to them and then framing the agenda based on what you're hearing across those dividing lines. And so you're looking for that Venn diagram overlap, where in a really divided society, the overlap area might be very small, but that's the thing around which then you're going to organize some collaborative action. And that's where Mobilize comes in, that you actually move from dialogue to people across dividing lines working on something together, collaborating on something that meets their shared interests, or that addresses concerns that they both have. And if you do that effectively, then it can expand, it deepens the trust, and can expand the area of common ground where people, well, this worked, we could try something out. But systematize is the really critical thing, and that's really where we try to move from just reconciling communities to actually driving enduring change. And in our experience, change becomes really embedded and sustainable, and it grows without external facilitation or funding or support when you've either triggered a change in institutions, how the police force polices, how the education system educates, how a network of radio stations covers a divisive topic so as not to inflame violence. You either change institutions or you change social norms, the way a critical mass of the population talks about and deals with its differences. This is where a lot of our dramatic media programming comes in. We're trying to popularize new social norms. Or you change market forces, that there are market forces that fuel divisive conflict, and there are like our current social media environment, the business models, I think, largely fuel destructive conflict. And there are market forces that fuel collaboration, like when you see the mediation industry, and people actually make a living mediating disputes before they get out of hand. And so once you get to that level of change, where you're talking about systematizing things in either institutions, norms, or markets, it all sounds very theoretical. It always starts with that very human level of humanizing, across those dividing lines. So my answer to your question would be that we have to first, in my view, we have to start with what are the key constituencies we're talking about here? So across racial dividing lines, political dividing lines, is this pretty, and then really listen to people and work very hard as we listen to people, not to sell them on an idea, but to listen to where they're coming from and identify where there are areas of overlap. And I think there are substantial areas of overlap where you could foster collaborative action in this country across all kinds of dividing lines. And they oftentimes won't be in the spaces where the national media narratives have already completely bifurcated the country. It won't be on those big national issues. It'd be more on local issues that affect people's lives, where they live, where they send their kids to school, et cetera. So I think that's a long-winded answer, I think, Heidi, to your question, but I think we have to start by engaging those communities in setting the agenda themselves, rather than setting the agenda and then trying to invite a diverse group to that agenda.
It's a great answer. One of the things that I was thinking about when you were talking and thinking back to something you said before, that I think that you said that you talk to anybody and that you're different in that respect from some other peace building organizations. Would you engage with a non-state, what we would call terrorist actor such as ISIS in this way? Or are you deal with them either not at all or totally differently? One of the biggest challenges to our field is that the field is largely funded by Western governments and multilateral institutions dominated by Western governments. And those governments have put legal restrictions on who you can talk to and who you can engage, and all these material support laws and all this. Right.
So the annoying legalistic answer to your question is we have to be really careful because of that. And that is not a mission-based reason, though, to answer your question. And from a mission perspective, we absolutely would engage with any group that has constituency. You engage them to learn where they're coming from. You engage them to understand also where are there fissures within groups that from the outside might seem monolithic or impossible or beyond the pale. We have done this kind of work a lot. And it's part of the value of a non-governmental peace-building organization. Part of our value is our irrelevance, our political irrelevance. I mean, if I'm the ambassador of a country and I go meet with an ISIS representative, then there are all kinds of questions about legitimizing them and recognizing them, blah, 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 whatever it might be. But nobody really cares very much if Shamil Idress or one of our directors in any of the countries where we work meets with whoever. And that's part of the power of being an organization like ours, being a non-governmental organization. And so to have that power undercut or stripped by laws that say you cannot even engage in mild ways with some of these parties is devastating, I think.
And there's no way around that.
You know, it's challenging. You know, we you know, there's a way I think to engage with different parties where you can make you can oftentimes or you can sometimes signal to relevant governments and ensure that they are okay with what you are doing. You know, but yeah, you have to always ask yourself whether you're putting the entire organization at risk if you're going to do something like that without first getting some sort of, you know, clearance.
Yeah.
And that's a real problem. I mean, I just came back, you know, when you and I were going to talk earlier, I just come back from Afghanistan where, you know, a party that supposedly no one was supposed to talk to or support for 2 decades is now running the government and is going to have massive impact on the lives of 40 million Afghans. And one of the Afghan civil society leaders was saying to me, you know, for 20 years, he said, he's still there. He said, for 20 years, civil society here was supported and funded and developed in opposition to these people, not to reach out to any of the folks who support them in any particular way, but actually in opposition to them as the enemy. Now they're in charge. And he said, now we have to find ways to work with them and work under the rules that they are setting. And he just expressed the challenge of doing that when for 20 years, you know, the last thing they were supposed to do was engage these people in any way. Now, I came out of you know, meeting with over 150 civil society leaders, men and women, UN agencies, as well as senior Taliban officials last month, convinced that there is not only great peril and danger and fear in the country, which there is, in addition to this humanitarian catastrophe, but also real opportunity for a wide range of programming and things that get done. And that, you know, one of the real challenges in getting it done was just how devastating the current international sanctions regime is. So that even activism that international parties want to support, you know, a woman running a center that gets international funding but is then told, but you can't use any of your salary that we pay for to pay taxes because the government is the Taliban. And now you're putting this Afghan woman in a position literally of having to be a tax evader vis-a-vis the Taliban authorities or not take your support. And that's just one tiny example of the many kind of obtuse and self-defeating things that happens as a result of this kind of thing. So anyway, I'm going a bit afield from what you were asking. To answer your fundamental question, from a point of principle, we see part of our value being our willingness to talk to and maybe more importantly, listen to anyone who has serious constituency in a conflict setting.
Makes sense. We only have a few minutes left. I want to ask a couple of linked broader questions. One is, what do you think are the strengths of the peace-building field as it currently exists? And the opposite is, what are the challenges facing the peace-building field, and how do you think peace-building needs to grow and develop in order to become more effective?
Well, some of the strengths are that, you know, when Search was established in 1982, there weren't a lot of sort of dedicated peace-building organizations, nonprofit organizations. There were, you know, at that time, peace-building was mostly, you know, diplomats negotiating peace deals behind closed doors, or once-in-a-lifetime movement leaders like Mandela or Gandhi or King, or
yeah.
And then you had some religious movements, the Friends, of course, the Quakers. Now there are the whole field has really grown significantly. Many more dedicated peacebuilding organizations with peacebuilding as their prime or sole mission, as well as most of the major development agencies and humanitarian agencies, almost all of whom dwarf even the biggest peace building organizations. Most of them have integrated, at the very least, conflict sensitivity, and some of them much more so effective peace building into their programming, out of a recognition that conflict really is, you can have decades of hard-won development gains that will be wiped out. Look at Ukraine today. You have decades of gains that can be wiped out within weeks of mass violence, both infrastructure destroyed, but also trust, systems of government, livelihoods, So there's been a recognition over the last at least 40 years that search has been around, and maybe really accelerated over the last couple of decades, that conflict is really a primary or like a first order issue, that our ability to deal with it well unlocks progress in all other areas, and our inability to deal with it well threatens every other aspect of human progress. And the peace building field, I think, needs to take some solace and some appreciation that, look, we collectively have helped to make that case, and I think the collective field has learned a lot of lessons over the last 40 years in terms of what works and what doesn't work. Unfortunately, I think that the field is very weak, too weak than we need it to be right now. Too many small efforts that are advancing mostly ad hoc, peace building initiatives, and that is not. I want to know, was that Margaret Mead quote or whatever? Never doubt that a small group of committed people can change the world. That's the only thing that ever has. I totally agree and believe that. So it's not about can small efforts make big change? No, that's absolutely can. And we need much more collective power in how we're addressing these issues. And if you take the question that you asked about how are we going to accelerate the emergence of a more effective world order, and a world order that's more effective at both preventing war and fostering the cooperation we need on things like climate, pandemics, etc. We have to be. I don't see sufficient strength in the collective peace building field to help drive that. That accelerated, evolution of the world order. I think that the field in the U.S. is not entirely, but largely informed by and dominated by the political left, and I think that is a problem of representation, constituency, and credibility when engaging on a lot of the issues that we deal with, and so I am not somebody who believes that you can or even should be neutral in conflict settings, but there is a difference between being neutral, in my view, and being impartial, or increasingly people talk about being multi-partial, believing that that oppressive systems, particularly when power is at play, where this political alignment becomes really salient, because people say, look, where you've got oppression or where you get power dynamics, you have to stand with and accompany the oppressed. And I agree on the importance and the value and the moral necessity of standing with and supporting those who are on the receiving end of these kind of power dynamics. But I also believe very much that what James Baldwin said about racism in this country, what Gandhi said in India, what Mandela and Tutu said, that oppressive systems really do trap everyone. And the real breakthrough for us is to get to, it doesn't mean that all suffer equally. I think that would be obscene to make that point, and I'm not making that point. You can't look at Ukraine today and say, well, all people are suffering equally. But those oppressive systems trap and limit everyone. And the place that we're trying to get to is not a victory of the oppressed over the oppressor, but a more just space where everyone actually will benefit. And I don't think that's a naive, solution. I think that's actually, effective and principled peace building is incredibly subversive to injustice. But I think if you go at conflicts, naming and shaming the injustice, which includes the perpetrators of that, and hoping that strictly adversarial or pressure-based approaches, let alone military approaches to that kind of oppression, are going to get us to break through to that future space. I think that's a pathway to mutual destruction. And so I think the peace building sector needs, to both domestically here in the U.S. when looking at issues of injustice and peace, and internationally, to really revisit, and I would hope reaffirm, those principles of really principled peace building, which begin by listening, which begin by recognizing that where oppression occurs, it's a trap for all, and to take what we've learned. And I shared with you some of what we've learned at Search, between the two major frameworks that I'd like to share with you that I think are really key here is, what are the ingredients of enduring change? That you've got to change. It's not enough to reconcile communities. It's not enough to foster dialogue. You have to change institutions, norms, and market forces. Those are the three things that lead to self-perpetuating and scaling change that doesn't rely on external funding or external intervention. And to get there, you need to be advancing, we would argue, on these 5 fronts. You have to be building intercommunal trust. You have to be building institutional legitimacy. You have to be reducing levels of physical violence, increasing people's sense of agency, and reallocating resourcing towards more collaborative, nonviolent approaches. And you can do all of that within pretty much any system. Democratic, less democratic, those were with historical injustices, those with less historical injustices. And those are the things that we're very committed to. So we would make the case for the peace building sector that we should be more intentional and explicit around achieving those kinds of goals and measuring results in those ways, and be very wary of getting caught up in a kind of peace building that will feel to many, many people like a Trojan horse for their side to lose and another side to win.
Beautiful way to pull it all together, what leaves me thinking, wow, that really makes sense. I think this pretty much covers the questions that I was thinking about asking. Is there something in your head that you're saying, boy, I wish she would have asked, but I didn't?
Not all, Heidi. I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate your and Guy's leadership for so many years now and helping drive this field forward. So it's totally my pleasure. I enjoy this time together.
Well, I enjoyed it thoroughly, and I'm delighted that you were willing to do this. We haven't done these interviews for a long time, and when we did them before, they were just audio. We didn't have the video capability, and you're the first one, and I'm thinking, yeah, this is great. Maybe we should do a bunch more of these. Really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.